6. Okay. Welcome to Class 6, your final day, your evaluation. This is where you are going to apply the ideas that we learned in the two different contexts we talked about. Sort of now we have these general directions. You can get more narrowly focused in each category, but we have the sort of therapeutic functional interventions, juggling as a platform to facilitate other outcomes, or creating juggling for the purpose of its accessibility. So just juggling itself, because we know juggling itself is just opens up a world of benefits, and there's all those applications there. So we're really going to be approaching the problem solving from two directions: having the juggling have an alternative impact and making the juggling accessible. And in those, different circumstances require that. If you were able to watch the video last night, I appreciate that. Maybe you were able to learn a little bit more about me as well and gain some understanding, just sort of why I'm so hardcore about everything. And also, I want you to watch that video to put in perspective, what my expectations are for you as well. And how I see this as being the beginning. We are at the frontier of a new age of juggling culture, because, when you really start to break down the impacts of what happens, what happens if we take away the barrier of that 3-ball cascade and that really crappy lesson plan, which is really just causing discrimination, right? So it's really a lesson plan that only accommodates privilege. So then you get this concentration of people with privilege inside this community, and they start to impose all this privilege, and you don't see a lot of diversity, right? So for me, it's sort of two parts to the problem, right? It's creating the solutions that make it accessible first. And then as we start to apply those solutions and our community becomes more diversified and we see more representation, then we will truly become inclusive. So there's the accessibility part, the physical accessibility part, which this is the part I could solve on my own and share with you. But the next part is the culture part. And that is going to fall on you guys. And you don't really have to think about it. You don't have to do anything different than you're planning to do already. You just have to share, we don't have to create division. We just have to create new opportunity. But there are definitely some things that need to change. So looking back, going back to the beginning with our formula solution now, on day one, it probably seemed a lot stranger than it does now, right? We talked about how this is our first step towards making juggling accessible for everyone. And I think it's more helpful for me to evaluate juggling experiences than it is to create them. So once I have an activity, I can use this formula now to evaluate its level of juggleness, so to speak, right? Because I'm looking for these elements. These are the elements that need to occur in order to stimulate the brain. And it breaks down into these 4. For the second and element, this is describing the sequencing, right? The interactions or the order of events in space. So our patterns of interaction. And then the 4th component is the one that we begin to play with the most at first, which is the sensory dialogue. Understanding that sensory dialogue really helps us create a whole new category of teaching strategies that don't involve that sensory dialogue, right? So this formula also allows us to begin separating the learning processes, and understanding the elements, we can separate their learning process as well. So that was our first indication of trying to think about juggling without thinking about it as its action as well. And in order to really understand the meaning, of that description, the idea is that it's describing the state of mind. It's describing what are the sensory stimulations that we use in juggling to produce this state of mind. And the description is not limited to juggling. If you understand juggling using the formula I described to you, then you understand juggling as being part of a spectrum that also includes music and dance. And I think I'm going to get into the sensory dialogue a little bit more today, and I think really show you the connection there. But the idea is global activation. It's the state of mind. It's an altered state of mind, whatever you want to call it, whichever background you have or how interested you are in these type of topics. It's real. It happens. Science shows us that. And the impacts of it are tremendous. I think it's comparable to, it's a biological need is what I would see it as, because another thing to reflect with evolution as well, and anxiety in society, because we evolved over time that the people who are more cautious, so more nervous and anticipating threat, survive, right? But the thing about being in that state of mind, if there's not actually a risk, like in modern society, then that tendency to perceive risk turns into like all sorts of crazy modern day mental health issues that everyone struggles with. So it's important that we enter these states of mind as well to give us a break from that type of process and always anticipation. So there's so many health benefits here that we can't even like begin to unpack. But the key thing for us to understand now is that we are really seeing this, we are using this as our indicators, whether or not the person is experiencing juggling. You can experience juggling without global activation if it's not that challenging for you, but this is going to be our intention. And we begin to unpack that formula solution by looking at the theory of process formations. I'm going to show on the next slide here. So the thing is to understand is that we were able to break that formula, we first looked at the anti-entropic sequences of orbital events. This is the first part of the equation we are trying to solve. And we talked about how because we have a bilateral nervous system and the way that our brains are divided and communicate, that there's actually only 4 primary relationships that we're able to form, sequencing relationships that we're able to form with space and time. And we were able to apply a system of hierarchy to these relationships in terms of complexity. And we equate complexity to how much bilateral communication signal is needed. Because we recognize that in all the communication pathways, there's only one choke point. There's one location in the brain where all that bilateral communication has to pass through, right? So we targeted that region and we're using that to quantify the challenge level of these different sequencing tasks. And we do it in order of complexity as well, so that we end up with synchronous lateral being the primary relationship that we begin interactions with, and asynchronous bilateral being the ultimate. The spatial sequencing maps, yeah, I feel like this is super fresh for you guys, so I don't really need to review this. I'm not even going to review this because I know you know it. It's going to bore you. The idea at the beginning, one thing I will emphasize, because we're about to go into creation, and I think we already started to get this idea yesterday with the examples, when you start to see the solo social, because when you do solo social, you start to create mixed dimensions, right? I have one ball moving on one axis and another, I'm interacting with you on another one. So it's really easy to add these dimensions, but just keep that in mind always, like don't hesitate not to put it in a straight line. Look at the person's body, look at what they're able to do and build around them, or, you know, set your goals for what you're trying to achieve. And we talked about at the beginning of the class too, the whole 5-point, you know, the way space is divided and how it makes sense and how it lets our 2 sides of our body interact and how the hand actually mirrors the same structure. And then the thing to understand, which I think is super clear as well, because in this seminar, we put the interaction with the juggle board before the theory or after the theory. So I don't think anyone is getting confused here about these ideas, but the entire intention is that all of this theory should be transferable, that you're not required to its action. Like the whole time this seminar has been trying to avoid being limited by any description of action. So whatever we're doing here, whatever I showed you here with this entire theory can be applied in any other movement, in any other situation. If you wanted to put these on the floor, you could use this to develop dance, you know, or you could use it to create an acrobatic game if you had people jumping in between, you know, footprints on the floor. There's so many applications of this idea. All I'm doing you now, all I've done for you is showing you how to apply these relationships, the relationships that we form with juggling, to these already existing systems of play that we see all around us. So the primary composition doesn't have to be performed on the juggle board either. So that stuff I think is really clear. It took a little while to unpack. We went through like super detail on all of those to understand the backgrounds. And then what we're able to do is we can put it all together. All this theory comes coming together when we reach the primary composition. It really models that. And I think this diagram here, this is the one we showed, because what this structure lets me do is I can start to explore patterns to find different sequencing relationships with space first. And then I can apply the theory of process formations to find every transformation and increase of complexity of that challenge. So you can explore, you could create another sequencing map, right? Another environment, and you can find 5 different patterns in that environment, and you can notate those patterns, and then you can transform those patterns, right? So the idea is it should be given us now like a temperature scale. Like it's a very clear map. It's very easy for me to, when I do see a person struggling with a problem, I know which problems are going to come next, and I know which problems are just before those problems, right? So this is applied, this concept is being applied in the material that we're using with the juggle board, with the primary composition, but you see how it's intended to be transferable as well, right? Try to look for ways to apply this in other disciplines is really helpful, because these sequencing relationships apply the same. So if you were working in acrobatics, you could pick 4 different movements, and then you could say, I want you to do those movements now: synchronous lateral, asynchronous lateral, synchronous bilateral, and asynchronous bilateral. And then by the time you concluded that lesson, you knew that you developed that movement with all of the sequencing relationships. So in that context, it doesn't have to apply to juggling, but you see how it's holistic. Because juggling allows me to experience everything. So any formula that describes juggling is going to describe any other type of movement in space. And I hope this color coded, I'm trying to make it clear to you, right? You see how that works now? It's just like, you know, okay, pick a challenge level of pattern, because we organized it here. Okay, I want the highest level pattern, pattern 4. Okay, I want the highest level relationship, asynchronous bilateral, boom. And you can just play this way. I'm pretty proud of that. And I really think it's so transferable. Like, can you start to imagine like using this same idea? It's the theory of process formations, the pattern numbers. That's because I'm using juggling, right? But replace everything on the y-axis with you know, a different discipline, a different movement, and then the theory of process formations apply, right? Okay. This slide. So you saw this image. I used this image in an earlier presentation when we first introduced this idea of deconstructing the harmonization with space-time and understanding what it is, and determining the difference between static interactions with juggling and dynamic interactions. I gave the analogy of the fish swimming in the water. And I think this is a great way to understand it, because in order to give, it's really hard for us to understand things without reference to things that are not those things, right? Like we really create all of our understanding, you know, in reference. So there's light, there's dark, right? There's hot, there's cold. And there are certain things like space and time, which we're not really able to have a reference outside of. And those are things that are harder for us to comprehend. But we do have ways of gaining information about those experiences. And we tend to like to apply this formula that we call juggling to these particular sources of information. And I want to make a connection for you here to show you that when we're working with juggling, right, we're obviously working with the 2 primary forces of mechanical and gravitational energy. So juggling combines, if you're toss juggling, you're combining the sensation of kinetic energy and potential energy. You're having to harmonize with both, right? Because there's a moment in that toss when that ball becomes weightless, you know, when it reaches an equilibrium. So all of these forces are at play, and even too, you can apply more the gravitational energy to things like contact juggling, right? Potential energy, keeping a ball still, you know, maintaining that potential energy also requires harmonization with that information. So that's pretty obvious. We haven't really, in all of juggling that I am aware of, we're pretty clear in that part. Like we have the debate about action, but we're all playing with these elements. But what's really interesting about these sources of energy, one from each category, kinetic and potential, is that both of those can easily be used to produce sound. You notice how sound doesn't fit into either kinetic or potential energy. This is what's so beautiful about it, is it pulls from all the other sources to be produced. It's why music has so much variation in its instruments. You know, think of all the ways you can produce sound energy using all these other forms of energy. So if you were to apply the mechanical energy or of juggling that we're using and added sound to it, you would produce music, right? And let's think of some of the other sources of energy that music applies this formula to. So music is anti-entropic sequences of orbital events harmonized by elastic energy, right? String instruments, those produce harmonic frequency waves, and then it creates a vibration that my brain processes and uses as a feedback signal and harmonizes with the external information. This applies to electric energy. You don't get as much sensory feedback information from these experiences, but we do create electrical music, right? The three sources of energy that we don't tend to interact with this formula of anti-entropic sequencing of orbital events tends to be thermal, chemical, or nuclear, and I think that is for obvious reasons. You could apply this formula to any source of energy in the universe and it would work, but I don't think it would be safe, really, to play with those ones. The one I want to draw your attention to, I think has a lot of potential. We've seen some exploration of, elite jugglers explore and play with magnetic energy. And I think that has a lot of potential for adaptation and something that I would encourage you to start to look for as well in your investigations, right? Magnetic energy. Cool. I don't know if this slide makes sense to you. Maybe it looks insane. I don't know. It's new. I'm trying out this material for the first time. Let me try to step this through one more time just to make it clear. So the idea is these are the two sources of energy we're playing with when we make juggling. We all kind of get this, right? But what I'm trying to highlight for you is that music, dance, and juggling are, it's not just subjective. They are one thing because you're using the same formula and it's just identifying that they use different sources of energy to produce different outcomes, right? Because mechanical energy can be turned into sound energy, which means the only difference between juggling that is music and not music is whether or not it makes a sound. That's it. Let's start to look at some videos. So I think it's pretty clear, especially because you guys just crushed through this course. We have our ingredients. We know how to make the juggling accessible. We want to start to look at some of its clinical applications here. So in this video, this video itself isn't so focused on like functional interaction with functional objects, but the people that are in this video are definitely from the functional population, right? So in terms of time on task and repetition, the outcomes of this form of delivery produces an expected 60 repetitions per minute, assuming participants are not overly limited by other barriers. So in most cases, even as you see here, working with very old people, it's not uncommon to reach a tempo, to have a frequency of about 60 beats per minute. Maybe a little bit less, but somewhere between 40 to 60 beats per minute, even if a person is, physically impaired, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start to compare that to expected outcomes of like linear methods and OT systems. One second, look here, the cup, watch the cup right there. You see that cup going back and forth? That's the whole point of my purpose to interact with that lady. I just wanted her to change hands with her cup. So as I was saying, the repetition here, like focus on that. Like you're seeing a lot of things at the same time. You're seeing the socialness of it and just the accessibility of it. But I want to focus particularly on the importance of repetition, because from my experience in partnering with clinical groups, providing juggling as a platform to other people, this is really the jumping off point for us. It's the fastest way for us to get in, share, show, raise the standards, raise the expectations of how much repetition we can get with different body movement and with different people. Because we're using rhythm, right? If I interact with you for 30 minutes, or if I interact with you for 10 minutes, I'm going to get 10 minutes of repetition. Whereas if I was not using a system of rhythm, if I wasn't using dance, music, or juggling to facilitate, then that linear task isn't going to produce as many repetitions, and there'll be interruptions. There'll be misunderstandings, there'll be interruptions, right? So in my comparisons that I did in my own research at the beginning, following around clinicians and trying to figure out what are their expectations for repetitions in these 30-minute sessions, and they were usually under 600 in a 30-minute session. And it was because lack of comprehension, interruption, distraction, many things. Lack of motivation is a huge one as well. So I discovered that became my goal. It's like, I just need to do better than these guys do in a 30-minute session in 10 minutes, and I win. And that's what this does. That's what the primary composition does, because it produces 600 repetitions. I'm going to keep playing this. It produces 600 repetitions per every 10-minute facilitation, like I said. So when you see me playing those cups of games with the water, I'll sit down with someone, and in a 12-minute period, I'll get them to do 600 repetitions pouring water with both hands. And when you start to compare that to traditional methods or existing methodologies, it's really hard to compete with that level of concentrated repetition. Not to mention the bilateral sequencing capacity development that's happening, right? The stimulation of global activation, right? And all the social and emotional communication skills that we're sharing at the same time. So just on the fact of repetition alone, we destroy. Then when you bring in all these other things, like, it really opens doors for you. You know, even if you're not able to explain it, if you can show people this, they will understand, right? Especially if you show clinical people, because we are achieving what they want to achieve. I should say this video too, we filmed this in 20 minutes. We were at this place for 30 minutes. Everyone in that room had never seen these things before. And when we walked in, they were all sitting like they were dead. And then afterwards, they were all talking, they were laughing, we were engaging. So I like to emphasize this point about the repetition. There's a lot of other values here too, but in terms of as we start to make our dialogue and our relationships, you know, the first thing we can offer these other industries is repetition. And why is that important? It's important for us too, because I find that when I work with circus people, a lot of times they can sort of undervalue themselves or feel intimidated when they go outside of circus. You know, when they start to work with doctors and OTs and things, it can be intimidating. Maybe not for you and your culture in Latvia, I don't know, but you know, in Latin America for sure, because that's socially they're at the bottom, you know. So you know, they feel very apologetic a lot of times, or they feel privileged to be given these opportunities. I want you to start to shift that frame of mind. I want you to start thinking like, no, you're not being given an opportunity, you are giving them an opportunity, right? Because if you present yourself that way as well and you understand the value you have, people will accept you this way. And I think emphasizing this comparison with the repetitions and showing you like you're not just a circus person. Like the goal of these interventions is repetition. If you can produce repetition, then you are doing the same job. So don't think of yourself this way anymore. Dream bigger. Here's another one, and I keep telling you guys, so on the YouTube channel, it's Ideas for Play. Like if you watch enough of those videos, it's going to click in your head what's going on here and all the different applications. So some of those videos I produce myself, and then others come from my training seminars. So in this video, what you're going to see is a mixed group of people coming from mixed backgrounds, a combination of clinical backgrounds and circus backgrounds. It's about half and half in this video. This person, for example, was an OT. He's not a juggler. And I want you to watch how they all create juggling in different ways and think about some of the intentions they might have. Not just looking at the juggling that they're creating, but thinking about what they might be trying to achieve with that juggling, right? So the idea is they took the same seminar as you, and they came up, this is what they did on their last day. Activity has sound, that's music. When you start to understand the theories with two individuals, it's very easy to expand them to any amount of individuals, right? Sequence in relationships, right? Theory of process formations, it's everywhere. You see what I say now when I'm like, you know, learn the theory, but when you get to the practice, just let it go. Just let go. It's all about creativity. It's all about play. You know, we dig into the theory so that we can make that play accessible. That your job going forward now is just to create play. This solo social activity, it still confuses me why people will sit there for so long doing that one game. Like they don't get bored of it. You know, it's very social. I think it really, you know, when you play that game, you're with that person. And I think a lot of people enjoy that part of it because the stimulation itself, I don't feel it justifies the amount of interest I see with that activity. You know, like with the juggle board, when I'm facilitating, I got to give you a lot more stimulation to keep you focused. But then when you go to that social environment, like I have so much attention with like not much material. It's a strange thing. And even in that, like all those educators, they start playing that game and they just love it. It looks more like dance. No, it looks like they're dancing. Here, so here's a group from Costa Rica. You can see you can start to use all the body parts, right? We focused on using the upper body at first, but it applies to both sets of limbs. So anyone who doesn't have arms can use their legs to juggle, right? And that all those, you can see, like, start to evaluate, are the objects in motion? Are they static? That's a good one. That one was a lot of fun. It was as surprisingly more challenging than it looks like. Because like when you're looking up and the balls are crossing, it's so confusing. This is a different prop. Let me find a better one. We had some good times in Mexico, that's for sure. Yeah, who doesn't have a good time when they go to Mexico, right? What else can I show you? Some simplicity. This is a good example of increasing the scale. So at the beginning, we focus, really on this micro understanding of the space, but it can expand infinite in scale, So this is a situation. This is a 5-point sequencing map, and me and Josefa are juggling people. Think about like all this such a simple game to play. Like maybe you've even played a game like this before, right? This is like a game, but the only thing I'm doing is adding those sequencing relationships. I'm creating choreography just by communicating through touch. So that's an example of like going up in scale. Okay, now I know what video I want to show. It's the Prague people. Everyone has a good time in Mexico, but Prague, those guys are really onto some social circus. Like their pedagogy there is like they're riding a wave. You should check those guys out. So this is my seminar from Prague, and I want to show this because they really applied this concept of using all the space. They were really good about that, like changing your location in space, not just making it about where your hands are in relation to your own body, but where you are in relation to other things and other people. So it's all about developing spatial awareness. And super fun and silly and so easy to put this material into shows. Like imagine you have a youth project, so much creativity. That prop was built by a blind man so that he could process site swap notation. Look at this thing. This guy, every lane, the ball will roll. The center 2 lanes, the ball rolls for exactly 3 seconds. The next one, it's 4 seconds, and the other one is 5 seconds. It's a prop that allowed him to explore site swap notation. And he thought of it himself. You start to see your aerial equipment in a different way, right? This is one of my favorite examples because these 2 boys, like they're acrobats, right? They weren't so interested in the juggling. And when they start to understand that they could make the juggling big, like this is how they wanted to express. They wanted to use their whole bodies. So now they have a way to do that. Like that was a super intense way to juggle. It gets tiring really fast, but that was their way to juggle, So I think that's like such a embodiment of what I'm talking about. Allowing them to choose which form of expression is best for them. So you start to see time in all of your circus props now, right? Hopefully. This should be inspiring. Scarves and rings are a really beautiful combination. So much material there. And also like very elegant as well. It's an elegant style of juggling. So, for people who prefer that over like strength. Scarves and rings, beautiful. Let's do one more and then we'll play. Yeah, I guess it's gonna be these guys. These guys are still my best. I don't know. These videos are really good. So this is in another city in Czech Republic. I feel like you guys would get along with these people. And really, I just want you to see just like the different abstract applications of the same idea, right? All of it looks so different. If you watch this video before you took this seminar, maybe it wouldn't have been as clear to you that everyone is doing the same thing. but that's what's happening. Well, these girls went a little bit more contemporary dance with it, but they are all stars. Like, just, it can be complicated, or it can be just about the combination of dance and juggling, right? That was another thing that was harder than it looked like. This was beautiful. And watching these two women play, like, it was just like watching children explore. Like, it was like you could have turned back the clock and they were 4 years old. Like, look at them, they're just exploring. And neither of them came into the seminar saying, I am a juggler, right? And look at the beautiful juggling they're creating. I'm not sure about this one, but I liked it anyway. You know, it really starts to get interesting, and you keep your kids engaged once you start adding in your location space. When you start adding in movement in space yourself, like changing where you are with the juggling, it gets into, it really stops looking like juggling. It just looks like play. Okay, so I could definitely show you more videos. Definitely. Then I want you to check out the YouTube channel for inspiration whenever you need, to get clear focus. But I want us to get into our first assignment of the day. So the idea is I want us to go through 2 creation periods focused on different outcomes. The first one is going to be in the same order that we did with the seminar too, because the accessibility part becomes obvious now. So for the first exercise, I want us to create activities where we're using juggling as a platform to facilitate something else, right? So we are now going to apply the adaptation and creation process of functional juggling activity for the sake of accommodating different needs and audiences. We're going to start by identifying a type of person whom you wish to facilitate with, and construct a system of play that encourages time on task and repetition while simultaneously engaging the sequencing behaviors of the theory of process formations. I know it's a mouthful, but we got this. So you're going to do, step 1 is you're going to figure out who it is you want to work with. So someone who toss juggling is not accessible to, right? No matter what. This can be true. It doesn't mean it's bad, but it can be true. So think of someone who's not going to toss juggle. And then you want to think of a non-juggling related goal with that person, something you want to help that person develop that's not related to juggling. And then you are going to create a juggling environment that helps that person develop that capacity, right? You've done this already. We've all done this already. Lots of great examples, but I want us to be more thoughtful in this process as well. Like, really, really think about that person and what barriers they're going to have. Think about the things that might be challenging to them, the things that will be accessible to them, because afterwards, when you share, that's what I want to hear you tell me. I want to hear your thoughts about more the why, not so much the what, because I know you got the what now. I know you guys can create. So as you're building these exercises, really think about how you would facilitate it as well, right? The outcomes of these activities should be focused around developing non-juggling capacities, such as interactions with functional objects. You can use dynamic, right? We introduced yesterday the combination. Adding dynamic with static is like super good, because you know you're going to get the person to move. If there's an object that has to move in space, then the person's going to create a rhythm with that object. But you don't have to have that part of it. And in this context, the juggling should serve as a platform by which to develop other things. Pretty clear. Because it's pretty self-explanatory now. We're doing the same activity, but now our goal is to produce the sensation of juggling. And we're doing it for somebody who's not able to throw and catch, okay? So now we're just looking at accessible juggling. So in that same exercise as before, but for accessibility. Last time was about functionality, looking for, like, thinking about movements we want the person to do, right? Looking at what the person is able to do, thinking about what we want them to do, and constructing the juggling with that idea. And in this situation, it's just going to be thinking about what can the person do and constructing around them. Like, you know, you skip your expectation. It's just all about figuring out. So you start the same way. Think about who do you want to work with? Think of a type of person that you're not going to be likely to succeed toss juggling, like Down syndrome, for example, or autism, or elderly populations. You know, really imagine who you're working with. Think about what their challenges are, and make a form of juggling that's accessible. Yeah? You think you can manage
Yes.
this? I think you
Yes.
guys can nail this. I know
We
you
can.
guys are going to destroy this. So with all the information that was just thrown at you in the last week, there's a couple key points that we can summarize with. Um, before I introduce those, I want to make it really clear too. I think we're all clear on this. You have an understanding with me that none of this is intended to be institutionalized, right? What we are talking about is starting a movement, a change in culture. So it's really open. The future of this is so open, and it depends on you. Like, this is my job now, is to create more people that can create juggling. So it's you guys that are going to determine the future. And I really, is why I'm so open with sharing, because it's not about like, it's about responsibility. It's about everybody taking responsibility, right? To make the world a more equal place. So to conclude with, to summarize, the things we now know is that juggling is an accessible activity for everyone. And that going forward, we now have the tools to transform and re-educate the way society interacts with and thinks about the discipline, right? We know we can make juggling accessible, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The next challenge is going to be culturally. And maybe that's another seminar that I'm going to give. I don't really feel like that part of this conversation belongs to me. Like, this is where my portion starts. The next part of inclusion, I think, is going to be, needs to be conversations that are being led by women and led by minorities, because that's the next level of inclusion. We need to start to look at some of the discrimination that we have in our culture. And, but again, that's a whole nother seminar. So in having these solutions, we provide much needed services to the world, so we fill many gaps. We also foster greater cultures of inclusion. The idea of circus with people who are different and diverse in itself is a statement to the world. Like, just by practice, you can't practice this without saying something to the world, right? And I think it's a beautiful combination. I really love the way juggling and disabilities, or, functional diversity complement each other, because juggling has always been seen as this thing, like most people see it as, oh, people who have talent do that, so it's this irony now that the inaccessibility of juggling from its past, which created this cultural hierarchy, now when you pair that with someone with disabilities, I could come to you and try to explain to you why a person with disabilities deserves the same, opportunities as everyone else, and you might not understand that, right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But when you see a person who you think has less ability than you doing something that you don't think you can do, that forces you to change your perception about them. So there's this element in everything that we do. The more we can share circus with people that society looks down on, the more we can help those people gain status in society as well. And that's what I think is so great about these two communities partnering together. And it's going to create more space and more opportunity for us to grow, which I talked about in the presentation video that you watched last night. The future of juggling is diversity, and anyone who fails to see this now is only trying to hold on to the past. Big hugs, big love, and peace out. You did it. You survived. Congratulations.